The Serebryansky forest in the Luhansk region is completely covered in fiber optic cables. Soldiers of the 63rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Ground Forces showed what the area looks like where fierce fighting is taking place. In these conditions, Ukrainian defenders are holding the line. Meanwhile, in the Kupiansk direction, the enemy attacked the defense forces' positions near Holyubivka, Stepova Novopavlivka, and Novokrolikivka. On the Lyman section of the front, the Russian army launched assaults near the settlements of Rakivka, Zelenaya Dolina, Rekidub, Kolodyazy, and Torsky. In the Toretsk direction, fighting took place near Toretsk, Nelipivka, and Oleksandro-Kalinov. In the Pokrovsk direction, which is the most active, Russian occupiers attempted to push back Ukrainian defenders near Myrolubivka, Novosergivka, Orkhov, and Alexievka.
The enemy is trying to stretch its flanks to widen the area of coverage, but we understand perfectly well, as the area of coverage expands, the density of the enemy's battle formations decreases, which means the effectiveness of the Russian offensive drops even further. I don't think that in the near future we'll be hearing particularly alarming news related to a deep penetration of Russian forces and assets into the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. This is an extremely difficult option in terms of providing logistics for the forward Russian units. And honestly, there's no real point or logic in these maneuvers. The enemy clearly doesn't have enough forces or resources to carry out such large-scale actions.
Border guards from the Phoenix unit of the Pomsta Brigade shared footage of their combat operations on the southern Slobozansky direction. Ukrainian soldiers, using drones, managed to destroy, among other things, an infantry fighting vehicle, an armored personnel carrier, and several more pieces of heavy equipment belonging to the Russian occupiers. Several trucks were also destroyed, and about 10 enemy infantrymen were eliminated. And in the Kupiansk direction, fighters from the Novopavlivka Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine destroyed several Russian ammunition depots. In addition, the Russian occupiers' weapons and radio equipment were burned. As a result of the work of Ukrainian operators, the invading army lost several dozen soldiers.
Oil, fuel, these are the lifeblood of the army. Without timely and full deliveries of, gasoline, diesel fuel, and special lubricants, equipment, including armored vehicles, comes to a halt, which, in turn, creates conditions for stagnation on the battlefield. That's why it's clear that the Ukrainian army is acting very rationally by destroying these kinds of targets as well. The enemy is experiencing certain logistical difficulties when it comes to supplying their forces and resources for scaling up and more active deployment of Russian troops.
And in the past 24 hours, 950 Russian soldiers were eliminated by Ukrainian fighters. The total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion have exceeded 1,014,000 people. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 6 enemy armored vehicles, 58 artillery systems, and 1 multiple rocket launcher were also destroyed yesterday. In addition, 131 drones were shot down and 123 vehicles were hit.
We're discussing the situation on the front lines with our guest on the air. Joining us is Dimmitro, a military and political analyst. Dimmitro, hello, glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Hello, thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you.
Thank you for joining our broadcast. Every day, we read out the report from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And the numbers. The number of attacks by the Russian Federation that they carry out daily on different sections of the front are incredibly high, and it seems like they're not even decreasing day by day. And we also see, judging by the losses of the Russian army, that the number of attacks is increasing, and, in particular, the losses are also growing. And the logical question is, has the enemy's tactics changed in any way recently, or is it only changing in a way that causes the Russian army to lose more of its resources?
The enemy's tactics are changing, but not in the enemy's favor. What we're talking about is that Russian forces have now changed the tactics of their assault groups. It's basically a one-way ticket. What's happening is that the so-called blocking detachments, meaning those who stand directly behind the assault groups, are starting to, at the moment the assault troops move directly into the line of engagement, they begin to mine the retreat routes. In effect, this makes it impossible to evacuate the wounded and, accordingly, for the assault troops themselves to retreat. It's precisely this tactic that has led to the increase in casualties among the Russian occupation forces. And note, It's the Russians themselves who are laying the mines, fully aware of the possible consequences of such tactics. And if we're talking about these so-called meat assaults, then at this point the Russian occupation army is relying on the only advantage they have left, their superiority in manpower. That's why we're seeing the scaling up of these so-called bonsai attacks. So what they're effectively using is this so-called wave tactic, a strategic approach where the initial assault group goes in and diligently tries to gain a secure foothold, and then right as they're attempting to firmly hold their newly acquired position, the very next wave comes in, pushing even further toward the established positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, aiming to overwhelm their defenses. But Ukraine's defense forces are taking this Russian occupier tactic into account as well. We're talking about the Ukrainian Armed Forces using what's called the drone wall tactic. That is, when the enemy's personnel and equipment are destroyed even as they approach the positions of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. This was brilliantly demonstrated during the recent Russian assault on Ukrainian Armed Forces positions in the Konstantinivka direction, where more than 20 units of heavy armored vehicles were destroyed. According to the occupiers' own estimates, referring to the 150th Motorized Rifle Division, the losses in personnel there are already approaching 100. And that's just from a single isolated assault. And this particular tactic, by the way, clearly shows that the Russian occupation army is apparently running out of precious time, and this significant shift in their tactics when deploying armored groups indicates that the Russian army is essentially a hostage to the Kremlin's overarching political decisions and strategic imperatives. And let me remind you, the Russian dictator announced the possibility of resuming so-called peace talks after June 22nd. And accordingly, the Russian dictator understands perfectly well that if there aren't at least some nominal tactical successes on the front line, successes that can be sold to the domestic audience and used as military political leverage against the Ukrainian side, then there's no point in further Russian demands, or as the Russian dictator calls them, proposals taking into account the current situation on the line of contact. They simply lose all relevance. That's exactly why we see this kind of tactic being used, combining it with meat grinder assaults, bonsai attacks, mining the retreat paths of assault groups, and essentially the outright disposal of the remaining armored vehicles.
Speaking of armored vehicles, Dimitri, I wanted to discuss this with you. Basically, the BBC reports, citing assessments from the NATO summit in The Hague, that the alliance believes the Russian Federation has, as of now, essentially reached the peak of its production capacity. Yes, its military-industrial complex is practically operating at the limit of its capabilities. But the alliance predicts that Russia is capable of maintaining this current level of combat operations until 2027. Right. But of course, this is despite certain increasing economic difficulties. Dimitri, how do you assess these kinds of positions voiced, as I understand it, by the experts and participants of this summit that took place in The Hague?
Well, let's say they're controversial. I'll explain what I mean. Let's focus specifically on the economic aspect, which is what the BBC is emphasizing, namely, the ability of the Russian Federation's economy to continue active military operations in Ukraine until 2027. So, the point is that at the time of the BBC's publication, the Russian dictator had signed a law adjusting the parameters of the Russian Federation's budget for 2025. And perhaps the BBC would be interested to know that this adjustment provides for an increase in spending by a relatively small amount, just 829 billion Russian rubles. And now, the main point. The federal budget of Russia for January and February ran a deficit of 3.8 trillion Russian rubles. And according to estimates by the Ukrainian intelligence community, the budget deficit of the Russian Federation in 2025 could increase to 2.2% of GDP. And for reference, BBC reports that this amounts to 55 billion US dollars. For Russians who are watching our program, that's 4.4 trillion Russian rubles. So, this is the language of numbers we should be talking about, rather than, frankly, using manipulative statements. Moreover, let's take a look at the statement made by the head of Rostec. Rostec, by the way, is the backbone, the main pillar of the Russian military-industrial complex. So, the head of the state corporation Rostek, Kemezov, was forced to admit that Russia is in an unprecedentedly difficult situation because of the war in Ukraine. Direct quote from Kemezov: "Russia is going through the most difficult times in human history and has entered a period of turbulence with no end in sight. Tell me, does this indicate that the Russian Federation is making full use of its economic capabilities and accordingly has effective results and the ability to continue the war in Ukraine? In my opinion, no. And proof of that, for example, is a report in the Russian media that a Stavropol enterprise, which produced microelectronics for the Russian military-industrial complex for aircraft and military equipment, was forced to halt production due to losses from fulfilling government contracts. In other words, government contracts are so unprofitable for the company that they had to stop production. And most importantly, colleagues, let's analyze those reports that were published about the Russian Federation's ability to produce heavy armored vehicles in the amount of 1,500. They were finally forced, after we repeatedly raised this issue, to change their rhetoric and admit that it's not about production, but rather about restoring, accordingly, old Soviet models of equipment. And you have to agree, as we say in our Odessa.
That's a huge difference. Yes, you know, your arguments make a lot of sense, and so do the numbers. I think all Russians now feel it, even, let's say, in their everyday lives, how food prices are rising, how there aren't enough jobs, wages aren't being paid, factories are shutting down. But nevertheless, yes, NATO intelligence data now clearly indicate that Vladimir Putin firmly believes in the Russian army's continued ability to fight and will undoubtedly intensify his attacks despite significant losses. At least, that's precisely what a high-ranking alliance official stated at the recent NATO summit meeting. And, aside from these economic nuances that you've already mentioned, what exactly are the logical, cases by which we can understand that this isn't true, right? So, if, roughly speaking, Putin were watching us right now, yes, aside from the economic, or, let's say, Russians, okay, let's address ordinary people. How can we explain in simple terms that this isn't true? Well, there are no resources. Even the human resources are running out, and there are already huge problems with the economy. What else is going to get worse?
It's already getting worse. We won't refer to the Western intelligence community, but instead, let's refer directly to, let's say, the capabilities of the Freedom TV channel in delivering truthful information to Russian viewers at this moment. And what we're talking about is that, according to reports from the Russian side, starting in July, Russians can expect a 10% increase in gas prices. There you have it. This is a country that is a world leader in gas production. In my opinion, this is already a brilliant assessment of the capabilities of the Russian economy and, accordingly, the economic potential of the occupying country. And it will be the citizens of the Russian Federation who will be the first to feel the consequences of the war in Ukraine. 10% is not the final increase in gas prices. Let me emphasize again, this is information from official representatives of the Russian political authorities, which, by the way, was announced at the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg. And most importantly, at the significant International Economic Forum held in St. Petersburg, I am directly addressing the citizens of Russia. It was explicitly communicated to Vladimir Putin that the extensive metallurgical enterprises of the Russian Federation may very soon come to a complete halt due to the severe lack of available sales markets and, consequently, those specific sectoral actions and stringent measures taken by various Western countries. And notice, all the key metallurgical enterprises are basically the wallet of the Russian dictator. I can only imagine how dire the situation must be if the head of a Russian metallurgical enterprise told the Russian dictator to his face, at an international economic forum, about the severe consequences for the Russian economy as a result of further escalation of hostilities in Ukraine.
Petro, I'd also like to talk with you about how the situation is changing, not just regarding Russia's shelling of Ukrainian territory, but also how we are working in this area, when we are under threat from various attacks in different unmanned aerial vehicles. Unlike the way the Russians operate, Ukraine continues to target only legitimate objectives. We're talking, one way or another, about facilities involved in the defense industry complex, as well as, generally, in the oil and gas sector, and so on and so forth. So, in Russia, they are reporting drone attacks. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported intercepting and destroying 18 Ukrainian UAVs, including 7 in the Rostov region. According to local authorities in Taganrog, a stadium and a sports complex building were damaged due to a drone crash. According to local telegram channels, the target of the attack in Taganrog was the Land Aero enterprise, which is involved in the production of aircraft. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, claims that it was specifically the Land Aero plant that was attacked. Let's hear their perspective and continue the conversation.
In Taganrog, something unidentified hit the Land Aero plant. This is an important hub in the Russian military-industrial complex, specializing in components for combat drones and control systems. It is involved in projects for the production of Orion drones, electronic warfare systems, and digital integration for strike FPV drones and loitering munitions. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Dimmitro, could you please tell us what significant goals are being achieved by this? Perhaps not as rapidly or swiftly as we would ideally like, but essentially the precise and targeted striking of Russian infrastructure facilities that are deeply involved in the crucial production of high-precision equipment and various advanced technologies that the Russian Federation currently uses in the development and manufacturing of the essential means and military assets presently serving the Russian army? And how would you assess the Russian Federation's ability to recover from such losses?
Yuri, the uniqueness of this situation, you mentioned 18 drones. As of 11 o'clock in the morning, the Ministry of Defense of the occupying country reported 21 drones. So it seems that 3 drones were apparently lost somewhere over Taganrog, as I understand it. But now, to answer your question, and again, I'm addressing the Russians here. And pay attention to the inconsistencies in the statements made by the official representatives of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. And accordingly, there's the political aspect as well. We're talking about Russian media here. Now, regarding the Ukrainian side's strikes on legitimate military targets. First and foremost, the Defense Forces of Ukraine and the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine are considering so-called preventive measures to prevent the scaling up of UAV production on the territory of the Russian Federation. All the stories about Russia's ability to produce and, most importantly, use up to 1,000 drones per day for strikes on Ukrainian territory are nothing more than elements of Russian information and psychological operations. I'll explain with specific examples. The Yelabuga plant, which was built in 2023, including with the direct involvement of Iranian specialists, has a design capacity of 6,000 drones per year. At the moment, dear viewers, per year, not per day, not per month, currently, after the production was upgraded, the capacity has increased to 10,000. There is a similar facility, Kupol, which produces up to 15,000 drones per year. And accordingly, the Kronstadt facility in Dubna, Moscow region, which was completely, well, let's put it this way, to change the wording, was struck by Ukrainian drones from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and as of now has ceased its production activities. Therefore, the total capacity of the Russian Federation to produce strike drones like the Garin 2 and Garin 3 is about 45,000, well, 50,000 at most per year. These are the real figures of the Russian economy. And now let's look at the actions of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and other components of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The strike on the Yelabuga plant, and not just once, in Tatarstan. That's the first thing. As I already mentioned, the production facilities of the Kronstadt plant in Dubna have been put out of operation. The strike on the plant in Saransk, the only one in the Russian Federation that was producing fiber optic cable for FPV drones, where the Russian army does have a certain advantage over the Ukrainian side. And accordingly, the drone strike by the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense on the plant in Yelets, which was producing batteries for UAVs. And today's drone strike on the plant in Tambov, which, among other things, was also involved in the production of UAVs. As we can see, we're talking about the comprehensive nature of the operations carried out by the Ukrainian Defense Forces and the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, aimed at preventing the large-scale production of aerodynamic strike systems. What is the Russian side's response? Well, first of all, let's talk about the fact that after the highly successful strikes by Israeli and American aviation on production facilities in Iran, the possibility of transferring both components and, accordingly, finished products has been reduced to a minimum. That is why, at the moment, the Russian Federation is considering the possibility of relocating production to the territory of North Korea. So, these are the most likely scenarios for how things will develop. That the Russian Federation, by using cheap labor, specifically directly in North Korea, will try to scale up the production of strike drones, both for the Russian Federation and for the North Korean Army, thereby also raising the stakes during moments of escalating military tension on the Korean Peninsula.
Also, by the way, regarding the fact that too many drones are reaching various important infrastructure sites in the Russian Federation, I'd like to point out that maybe the problem is that all of Russia's air defense is either concentrated on the front line or in Crimea. Because we're seeing more and more reports that more and more air defense systems are being moved there, so maybe something is going on there. But now I'd like to talk about air defense for Ukraine, because Volodymyr Zelensky, for one, shared details of his meeting with Trump, which took place on the sidelines of the NATO summit in The Hague, Netherlands. The presidents discussed the purchase of American air defense systems and the possible production of drones, and in turn, Trump promised to check whether he could provide Ukraine with Patriot systems. The question is, how good of a sign is this statement from Donald Trump, considering that he's been rather reserved in his statements lately, and in general?
It's quite remarkable. I'll quote the NATO Secretary General, who said not to pay attention to Trump's political statements, but to focus on the concrete actions of the United States in terms of increasing allocations for collective defense and, accordingly, military technical assistance to strategic allies. Brilliant words from Ruda, which really characterize Trump's own actions. And let me remind you, after Trump's phone call to the Russian dictator, the issue of re-exporting American weaponry for the needs of Ukraine's defense forces was taken off the agenda. And the first thing our strategic partners supplied, with the permission of the United States, was 100 PAC-3 missiles for the Patriot system. And Russians, the cost of a single PAC-3 missile is $8 million. And it's quite remarkable notice that on the sidelines of the NATO summit, the UK announces the transfer of 350 missiles for air defense systems. And moreover, 8 additional launchers are also being provided. This is a very significant development. And what's most remarkable, and probably something Russians will be interested to know, is that the increase in military technical aid to Ukraine is being funded by frozen Russian assets, specifically the interest earned on those assets. It's a brilliant move by the UK, which decided to use Russian capital for modernizing its own production and, accordingly, transferring the finished products to the Ukrainian side. And it is important to notice, at precisely the same time, that Germany is actively announcing significant investments in the Ukrainian defense industry to produce advanced strike drones, which are better known to Russian forces as the Ludii drones. And the range of this UAV is about 2,000 kilometers. So now Russian citizens will have to get used to the sounds of air raid sirens and, accordingly, clearly understand that the concept of rear areas in the Russian Federation simply does not exist anymore. Especially after the successful operation conducted by the Ukrainian Special Services, an operation called Pautina, when Russian forces were genuinely surprised to learn that even their airfields located deep within the operational rear on Russian territory were well within range. Break time equals 0.5s/.
Dimitri, thank you very much for joining our broadcast. Thank you for this analysis. We appreciate it. You're always welcome on Freedom TV channel. Dmitry Snezherev, military political analyst, was with us live.